Welcome to listening. I have discovered a better way to upload videos, so I'm going to try this one in a single part. If it doesn't work, then you won't be hearing this, so it doesn't matter. But if it does work, it's all one continuous thing that you can stop or start as you see fit. So today what we're going to be discussing is listening. Now, for those of you who are actually reading your book, you will notice that there, on the schedule, there are only certain page numbers set up because this book's version of listening was pretty crappy. So I have pretty much kind of created my own using other sources. But the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do a little exercise that I want you guys at home to play along. Normally we do this in class with 2 people. And I'm going to read a series of things for you. And then I'm going to ask you a series of questions. I want you to answer them. Don't write them down. Just listen and answer. We're going to do a couple of these. And the first one is Saved by the Bell characters. Screech, Mr. Belding, Zach, Slater, Lisa, Kelly, Ginger, and Jesse. All right, I'm going to ask you some questions. Who was first? Screech. Which 2 ended in ER? Slater and Ginger. Which name was last? Jesse. Who was second? Mr. Belding. Now, how many of those did you get? Usually on this one, people get 3, sometimes, usually 2, 50%. I got another one for you. College majors, history, education, communication, psychology, criminal justice, English, and art. Which was first? History. I'm looking because I don't want to say the wrong thing. Which 2 started with E? English, education. Which was 2 words? Criminal justice. And which was last? Art. How many of those did you get? Did you get a little bit better? Did you get worse? Here's one that's a little bit more realistic. This might be something that you might actually encounter. Shopping list. 1 gallon of 1% milk. 2 loaves of bread. 1 dozen eggs. 1 pound of butter. 2 pounds of ground beef. 1 box of Rice Krispies. 3 onions. And finally, dish soap. What type of cereal is needed? Rice Krispies. What sort of milk is on the list? 1%. How many onions do you need? 3. And which of the items should you not eat? Dish soap. How many of those did you get? Now, I don't know about you, but a lot of times we use our phones maybe, or we just text people. But sometimes that's not available to us. So you have to remember a list that has. That's a list of like 5 or 6 things. And most of you probably got 50% at best. And then here's one that's even more complicated, that's even more like real life, although now with GPS and everything it's becoming less important. Directions to somewhere, it doesn't matter where. At the stop sign, turn left. At the yellow house, turn right. Go past the church on your right. Go through the blinking yellow light. If you pass the school, you went too far. Our house is the 3rd on the right. It is between Liberty and Plum. Which direction do you turn at the stop sign? That would be left. If you pass what, it means you went too far. School. Which house is ours? 3rd on the right. What do you do at the stop sign? Turn left. We already asked that one, but it was on there twice. And which streets is our house between? pong? How many of you ended up in Albuquerque? How many of you actually made it to my house? Now, those little cards are just a fun little activity. It's definitely different when we're in class and doing it. But they're just designed to show you that we're not very good at listening. Even when I told you to listen ahead of time and pay attention, you probably still never got more than about 50% of the answers. And some people are like, oh, but that's memory. Yes, but memory is tied in with listening, and we're going to talk about that. So, as I said, generally speaking, we are pretty bad at listening. So this chapter is all about how to improve, understanding the process, and making yourself a better listener. We're going to discuss listening and the stages of listening. We're going to discuss how to improve your accuracy and effectiveness. We're going to discuss some of the barriers to effective listening. We're going to look at some of the styles of listening and why it's important to understand those styles. And then understanding what active listening is. So the first thing is, what is it? Listening is something that we spend the majority of our day doing. As you can see by your PowerPoint, if you're looking at it, you're going to see that listening comprises the largest part of what we do in a given day. Over 50% in most instances, especially if you're a student. And many of your jobs might also require listening. But we're bad at it. Every year companies do, they get these communication consultants to come in and evaluate their communication efficacy. And listening is the one skill that always is at the top of most desirable skills, but it's almost always at the top of poorly executed skills. So we all know it's important, and yet we don't do it very effectively. And why is that? Well, I believe it's because we don't think about it on a daily basis. Unless you have a hearing issue or you're having some hearing problem like a cold or something on that given day, we don't think about listening at all. We think, oh, we're born, we can hear, therefore we must be able to listen. But the truth is, listening and hearing are not the same thing. They're very different. And this is where students often drive off cliffs because they mistake hearing for listening. And then when it comes time to take the test, they fail miserably because they never actually listened. Hearing is simply a physiological process. You do not have any choice unless you have earplugs in or a headset or something. It's something that happens. Sound waves are cruising along through the air. They go into your ear canal. They hit the tympanic membrane, i.e. eardrum. They send a bioelectrical chemical response to your brain, and your brain is like, sound, right? It doesn't process that sound. It just says sound. This is why in horror movies, people are walking down the path, and they're like, da-doop, 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 and then they hear, and their head's rolling down the path. Because their brain didn't say, hey, dummy, that's a chainsaw. They just heard the noise. They said, hey, what's that? No. And then their head's rolling down the path again. Listening, however, is a process. It is an active, complex process that we're going to break down for you today that involves 5 steps. Because remember, processes means it has a step to it. It has some steps to it. It also means it's a skill, which means it can be improved upon. And the more training you take as a listener, the better you're going to be at being an active, effective listener. And the better listener you are, the better your relationships are going to be, the better your schooling is going to be, the better your jobs are going to be, because you're not wasting anybody's time. You're responding the correct way, not the way that you think they want you to respond, but you're actually responding to what they're saying and or doing. So listening is where you're walking down the path and you hear that noise and your brain goes, holy crap, that's a chainsaw, and you start running. You don't say, hey, what's that noise? No, you like, oh, your brain processes it. That's a chainsaw. And you start running pell-mell through the woods. So it's very important for you to understand the difference between hearing and listening. Because if you mistake hearing for listening, you're not going to be a good listener. So now we're going to take a look at the stages of listening, the steps, the parts, whatever you want to call it. And the first stage is mindfulness or receiving. This book calls it receiving. It's more than that. I think it's a lot more than just getting the sound. It's getting physically and mentally prepared to listen. Getting physically prepared to listen would be doing things like removing headphones, sitting up straight, facing the person that is speaking to you. Those are physical things that you can do to improve your ability to listen. Psychological things, mental things would be telling yourself, okay, I have to focus now, kind of getting rid of some of those internal distractions, which aren't easy, but listening isn't necessarily easy. That's why we're bad at it. You also want to create an environment that is set up for listening. You want to get rid of that noise. Remember chapter 1, we talked about noise, the communication model? Try to eliminate as much noise as you can. That's going to make listening far more easy because you're able to focus on the appropriate sounds as opposed to the inappropriate sounds. Resist tuning out. Do not give in to your own internal noise. This is hard, You should never assume what a speaker is going to say, because that's going to lead to conflict and miscommunication. And you should never be distracted by what a speaker sounds like or looks like, because if you're focusing on what they look like, you're missing their message. Focus on the words themselves. We talk about that throughout this entire chapter. Avoid interrupting. When you are interrupting, what that essentially boils down to is, while you should be listening, you're forming a response. And your brain can process between 400 and 600 words a minute. We speak between 100 and 120 words a minute. So your brain has time to formulate a response after they're done talking. Don't spend the time that you're supposed to be listening formulating what you should say. That's why the thing says make the shift from speaker to listener. When it's your turn to speak, speak. When it's your turn to listen, listen. Don't be thinking about what you're going to say next, your rebuttals to them when it's your turn to be listening. That's the first stage. Now you can see very easily what happens if you leave that stage out. You're not going to be putting yourself in a position to effectively listen to the message. Now the second stage is understanding. It's being able to take the message, take what they're saying, and accurately decode it to give yourself a meaning. And listening is a process in the same way that every other part of communication is a process. And it is also a two-way street. So going back to the mindfulness step first, it is the job of both the sender and receiver of messages to get rid of noise, to be prepared to listen, to make that switch. And then you go into the understanding stage. It is, again, the responsibility of both the sender and the receiver to make sure that the receiver understands the message. So as a sender of messages, you have to present your message in a way that makes it easy for them to understand, right? You choose your language correctly. You make sure that your verbals and your nonverbals match. You organize the message in a way that makes sense. You're not bouncing all over the place that they can't follow along. Now, not all speakers are like that. So as a listener, you have to sometimes dig a little deeper. You have to go in and try to find what they're really trying to say. Sometimes you have to interpret nonverbal cues, especially when the nonverbal and the verbal don't match. And this includes silence. Silence is a very powerful nonverbal tool. And you as a receiver have to make sure that you're able to understand, what does that silence mean? And if you don't understand, what you do is you ask clarifying questions. I know students don't like to ask questions. This is why some of you have not done a lot of your assignments, because you don't understand them. So you just don't do them, which is terrible because that's going to affect your grade at the end. No, if you don't understand something, you need to let the speaker know, the sender know, that you don't understand them so that they can clarify. Because the word clarify means to make clear. And that's what you do. So if somebody were to say to you, hey, I type fast. What does that mean? Doesn't mean much to anybody. What does that mean? So you'd say, well, how many words a minute do you type? That would be clarifying, because you're looking for something to be made clear to you. So when you email me with a question about a journal or a question about an assignment, you are essentially asking a clarifying question because you don't understand something. I'm going to make it clear for you. Hopefully. Now, how do you let them know that you... Sorry about that, the camera fell over. Whoops. How do you know that... How do you let them know that you understand or you don't understand? Well, in addition to asking questions, you can paraphrase. So you can say, oh, so what you're saying is, and then you essentially repeat what they say, but in your own words. This lets the original sender know that you understood them. Or it lets them know that you don't understand them and they have to clarify. So make sure that you understand messages. When you're sitting in a classroom and they're giving out assignments and you're not understanding it, now's the time. Now's the time to ask for clarification. So that's the second stage. The third stage is evaluating the information. This is where you're taking that information and you're looking at it and you're saying, is this true? Is this false? Is it fact or is it an inference? And we as a culture are pretty bad at being able to separate what is fact versus what is inference. And we often present our own information that is opinion, that is inference, as factual information, which just makes things crazy. A fact would be, Julie got an A on her test. That is a fact. You can either prove it or you can disprove it very easily. An inference is basically a conclusion drawn from a fact, would be, Julie got an A on her test because she studied really hard. That's an inference. We don't know why Julie got an A. She could have cheated. Maybe she has a photographic memory. Maybe, who knows, right? There could be all sorts of different reasons why Julie got an A on her test. But if you say Julie got an A on her test because she studied really hard, that sounds like a fact, but it's really not. So you have to be careful. So when people are presenting information that seems off to you, you want to ask another type of question. You know, we talked about clarifying questions, which help you understand, but in this section we talk about probing questions. And a probing question is a question that is designed to help you make a better judgment. So let's say you go to buy a car, and that person tells you, this car gets really good gas mileage. And you're like, well, that doesn't mean anything, so I'm going to ask a clarifying question. And so you ask a clarifying question, which is, hey, how many miles a gallon? And they respond to you with, oh, this car gets 75 miles to the gallon. And you're like, wait a second, that doesn't seem right. So you ask a probing question. And the probing question is designed to get you more information so you can make a better judgment. So a probing question would be, oh, really, can you show me the report that shows that it gets that? Because you want more information to make a better judgment. That's what probing questions do. That is an important idea. You're going to see that on the test. The difference between a clarifying question and a probing question. All questions are designed to give you more information. It's what you're doing with that information that is different. When it comes to evaluating, compare the verbals and the nonverbals. Do they match? Because oftentimes when people are being dishonest, they're saying one thing and doing another. You know, their verbals say one thing, their nonverbals say something very, very different. So when somebody walks up to you and says, sorry, they're probably not very sorry. Don't evaluate, though, until you've gotten the entire message. Don't evaluate until you have some kind of background on the speaker. Because all too often, we judge too quickly. You know, oh, that person's a Democrat, so I know what they're going to say, so I'm not going to listen to them. Or, oh, that person's, you know, they start to talk about something similar, but then they go somewhere very different, but you stop listening, so you didn't hear their new message. Don't evaluate, again, until let the speaker speak. Let the speaker get the message out. Then you can evaluate. Don't evaluate it until they're done. The next stage, and the one that is, in my opinion, left out the most, is the response stage. This is what makes, if you go back to chapter 1 in the communication model, the feedback, the response, is what makes it a transaction. Listening is no different. You need that response so that the original sender understands that the original receiver got the message or didn't get the message. And the response stage often takes the form of what are known as back channel cues. And a back channel cue is usually a nonverbal or a non-committal verbal thing like, okay, oh, or those are back channel cues. They send little signals that let them know that you got it or that you didn't get it. But it's often left out. And this is often causes a lot of problems because you have to make assumptions that they either got it or they didn't get it. So if you assume that they didn't get the message, you repeat it. And then they get mad at you because you repeated it 10 times, right? So you're playing a video game or watching a movie, and somebody's going into the kitchen. You're like, hey, can you get me something to drink? And they're like, and so what do, being a normal human being? You say, hey, can you get me something to drink? And then you don't respond. And then, of course, what do? You yell it really, really loud. Hey, could you give me something to drink? And then they say, I heard you the first time. Well, why didn't you say something the first time? Why didn't you respond? Why didn't you save us both the time and energy that we just invested into this thing that could have been something so little and then all of a sudden it's big? You've all been there. So you as a receiver have to respond. You have to let them know that you got it. Again, even if it's a back channel cue, you got to let them know. As a sender of messages, though, you can also do your part to make sure that they respond. You can ask a question. What did I just say? As a teacher, I do that all the time. I'll be talking to students, and you know, sometimes when I feel like they're glazed over a little bit, I'll ask somebody, what did I just say? Paraphrase what I just said. Because I'm forcing them to respond so that I know that they either got it or they didn't get it. And the final stage is remembering. And if you go back to those cards, a lot of people think that this is where everything's at. It's about remembering, which is true. Listening and memory are very, very tied together. But to be able to recall messages, you have to listen first. You have to do the first 4 stages. Because if you don't do the first 4 stages effectively, this stage isn't going to be very effective. Now, when it comes to listening in the stages, they all kind of happen at the same time. The only one that happens first is the first stage. You know, you have the mindfulness stage, getting ready to listen. All the other stages kind of happen at the same time. But if one of those stages is broken down, you are not going to be able to remember. And remembering is exactly what it sounds like. You're taking information that you listen to and moving it from short-term to long-term memory. But the problem is, you know, we have issues with this for a lot of reasons. We filter messages, meaning we only hear the part of a message that already confirms to what we believe, you know, or how we feel. We ignore the parts of messages that we don't like. We focus on stuff that's easy to remember, but forget the stuff that's a little bit less desirable. This is why people can memorize a song that they hear twice on the radio, but can't remember their own Social Security number. Because the Social Security number isn't desirable or fun or interesting. But the song is. So you remember the song, but not the important information. How many of you actually